Good morning. The following is a presentation on evaluation, gatekeeping, and remediation by Mark Resch. So, evaluation, gatekeeping, and remediation. First, we're going to start with kind of just a brief overview of the role of counseling supervisors in higher education. Essentially, counseling supervisors are educators to aspiring counselors in higher education. Now, these aspiring counselors can be in the mental health field or they can be in the school counseling setting. And the manner in which these counseling supervisors interact with their learners is very important. This interaction can take place both in person or virtually, and counseling supervisors have to kind of operate from a theoretical and pedagogical foundation. So this means they need to be well versed in their counseling theories and also their ability to differentiate instruction in their work. And when that happens, they reach the greatest amount of learning and learners. Now, just synthesizing some of the existing knowledge that's out there regarding counseling education and counseling education programs and supervisors, it all stems from their ability to clearly communicate to their learners. Now, this communication can vary from the expectations that they have in their coursework. It could be the timelines that they hold. It could be the type of assessments that they provide to their learners. Also, very important is the ethical standards of their course room, how they essentially will monitor what goes on in the course. So all of these things combined allow for the most effective counseling education programs and supervisors to operate. Now, when we get into what exactly evaluation, gatekeeping, and remediation is in regard to counseling learners, there are several supervisor responsibilities that we're going to touch on. First, we'll kind of just get some working definitions for the three. Evaluation, again, that goes into how students are being assessed in the classroom. This can regard performance, it can regard timelines. This is one of the most basic functions of a counseling supervisor, counseling education supervisor. Gatekeeping is more or less the supervisor's ability to intervene when progress is not being made on behalf of the learner. This, again, we'll get into gatekeeping a little bit further down into the slides, but this really goes into the counseling supervisor's ability to check a student when they are not making sufficient progress. And then if that is the case, it leads into the final aspect, which is remediation or the act of remedying something. In this case, it would be a learner's performance in the program. Now, luckily for supervisors and for counseling programs, the American Counseling Association really sets out a guideline, 8 essential rules to follow in terms of counseling programs. While I'm not going to go into each one of these, I can more or less kind of speak to the general idea of what the American Counseling Association is trying to delineate here. And it all comes back to this idea of communication. Communicating values and ethics as it relates to the profession and as it relates to the course room are vital. Just touching on the skills and knowledge that are needed to complete the program, touching on the technology that's required, the timelines, the objectives. Very important is the type of evaluation that will be used, whether it is in discussion formats that'll be graded in the virtual setting, whether it's submitting PowerPoint presentations, whether it's submitting papers. How learners will be evaluated is crucial for supervisor and student success. Also, another American Counseling Association stipulation that's worth noting are really what is required in terms of clinical field experience when you're going to maybe potentially have to report to an institution if you're a virtual learner. Um, what will consist, what practicum and internships will consist of. Again, when all of these items are clearly communicated to the learner through multiple um, mediums, the greatest amount of success will occur. Now, what are some potential warning signs that remediation may be needed on behalf of a learner if they are not meeting those 8 stipulations that were outlined by the American Counseling Association? CACREP, which is the Council for Accreditation of Counseling and Related Programs, really takes it one step further and clearly notes 2 ways that remediation may be needed on behalf of the learner. And this is if performance indicators are not being met. CACREP outlines 8 different areas of core counseling competencies that are required on the behalf of learner. If a supervisor feels that any one of these is not being met, then remediation may be needed. If a learner hasn't demonstrated any proficiency when it comes to assessments. Now, we're not just talking one type of assessment, we're more or less talking about multiple types of assessment. This is where supervisor differentiation of instruction becomes important because it allows the learner to demonstrate proficiency in multiple areas. If again, multiple areas of assessment are not being demonstrated or not being met, and potentially remediation may be needed. Now, it should be noted at the bottom, and it is, that these are only 2 types of indicators that remediation may be needed. Case by case remediation really varies from institution to institution, from learner to learner. We could also throw in any unethical or illegal practices that occur on behalf of the learner. That means cheating, inappropriate commenting in a course room. Any one of those things could also lead to remediation or also program dismissal. CACREP really just outlines the academic portion of when remediation may be required. Now, if remediation is required, here are some suggested supervisor interventions. These interventions were outlined by Henderson and Duffrey in 2017. So, first and foremost, increasing interaction with the learner through feedback, through check-ins. This is kind of a first, maybe what we would call a tier 1 intervention that supervisors can have. Just reaching out to learners, providing them with a little flexibility if they need it, kind of just seeing what's going on, where their struggles are manifesting from. If that first level of intervention is not successful, the supervisor can then go through this checklist and really see what's needed. Possibly repeating a course could be needed, withdrawing from a particular course, maybe given a second attempt for the learner to complete that coursework. Maybe adding a few assignments, differentiating the assignments on behalf of the supervisor could lead to learner success, and then maybe possibly requiring learners to seek personal counseling. That's always an intervention that can be utilized. Now, as always, there are ethical challenges when it comes to the profession of counseling, and that is no different when it comes to supervising potential counselors. So ethical challenges, again noted by Hutchins et al. In 2013, they basically noted 4 primary responsibilities that counseling programs and supervisors have to learners. The first is to always remember that these programs are somewhat subjective in nature. While we may have specific academic goals that we have for our students, there is a bit of subjectivity that comes with the territory. So counseling educators need to be aware of that. When you're aware of that, you're naturally going to be able to support different learners of varying abilities, of varying ethnic, racial, sexual backgrounds. When counseling educators are aware of this subjectivity and are aware of uh, multicultural students and the students' needs, um, this kind of meets those responsibilities, those ethical responsibilities. However, with that being said, counseling supervisors need to be aware that these learners will be interacting with future clients. And if there are red flags that are being seen by supervisors, if students are struggling in multiple counseling competencies, that needs to be addressed. So while we keep in mind the subjectivity of the program and the the varying nature of our students, we also, as supervisors, need to be very cognizant of the potential client. And this is really where that gatekeeping comes in. Um, when we are seeing that learners are not meeting program expectations, remediation needs to be utilized. Now, this is when we really put those ethical challenges. These are some of the steps we can take and put them into action. Um, Addressing these ethical responsibilities, if remediation is needed, um, supervisors can essentially develop a remediation plan with a learner. This was recommended by Hutchins et al. In 2013. This remediation plan can provide a timeline for learners, can provide basically a rundown of the different counseling skills and competencies that are not being addressed. And it could, again, provide varying assessment techniques to address these particular skills that the learner hasn't met. Um, and again, once the learner is given this opportunity to address specific skills, if the learner is then unable to meet these requirements, this remediation plan, then potential dismissal from the program can be explored. Um, this really reminds me personally, coming from a background in education, almost as how an individualized education plan would be laid out for a learner um, that struggles attaining a particular skill. Um, this is essentially the same thing. These remediation plans, again, attempt to properly address the skill that is not being met and attempts to bring the learner up to that level of mastery. And there is our resources. So essentially, uh, highly effective counseling supervisors and by proxy programs communicate ad nauseum to students. Uh, so thank you very much for your attention and have a great day.